Now moving on to the speaker for today, Dr. Roshan Danesh. He has a doctoral degree from Harvard Law School. He works, researches, and teaches in the areas of law and religion, constitutional law, indigenous rights, and conflict resolution and peace building. He's taught at several universities worldwide and published articles on Baha'i law in a number of academic journals and other publications, including the Journal of Law and Religion, Religious Studies and Theology, Baha'i Studies Review, Journal of Baha'i Studies, World Order, and the Baha'i World. His book, Dimensions of Baha'i Law, was published in 2019. So we are very fortunate to have someone with such a wide-ranging set of interests in religion as it relates to not only the Baha'i faith, but religion in general, law and religion in general. And we can now turn to Roshan and hear his presentation today. Welcome, Roshan. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Hello to everybody, and thank you for joining us. I just want to acknowledge it's International Women's Day as well. And thanks to the Wilmette Institute for asking me to give this short presentation. In thinking about what I might talk about, I kind of sort of reflected back on the last 25 or 30 years of scholarship on Baha'i law and the b-i-Aqdas, especially since its translation and dissemination in English starting in 1992. And, there's really been four areas of focus of how it's been studied and talked about, both in the academic literature, but also in the community. One, predominant way in which we think about it and talk about it and write about it is just trying to describe the contents. Often that's focus on looking at the rules and laws and how we understand those within it and describing what's in the book and how it's organized. Another common area of study and discussion is just about the context and the roots and the Islamic roots in particular. A third is about the structural aspects of Baha'i law and Baha'i legal orders. And, sort of the constitutional dimensions, the roles of institutions, the relationship between Baha'i institutions and civil society, and those dimensions. And the fourth is just about social questions. We see a lot of discussion within the community, within the Baha'i community, and within the literature about social questions that are addressed by Baha'i law. But I guess in thinking about that, decided not to really speak or focus on any of those, at least not directly, but rather to reflect on something that I think underlies all aspects of thinking and talking about Baha'i law, which is the orientation or the stance or the approach we are encouraged to take to it by Baha'u'llah, by how he talks about law, by the encouragement he gives to how we should think about law. And if you look at Baha'u'llah's writings about law and about the b-i-Aqdas in particular, and you'll see this in the introduction to the b-i-Aqdas by the Universals of Justice, right at the end, page 1718. They have all of these statements from Baha'u'llah about the importance of having a perceiving eye, of pondering, of having an understanding heart, all of these about apprehending the book, all of these statements about the approach that we need to cultivate. And the notion that if we don't approach Baha'i law in the way Baha'u'llah encourages us to think about Baha'i law, that we're going to have a very distorting effect and a very distorting understanding. And of course, this is talked about in the b-i-Aqdas itself in multiple places. For example, paragraph 99, where he says, weigh not the book by the balance, weigh not the book by the standards current amongst you, and then goes on from there to describe. And there's other places as well. So, this is, sort of somewhat similar to a talk I gave for the Wilmette Institute 4 or 5 years ago, but sort of just wanting to go deeper into that foundational orientation we bring to how we talk and think about Baha'i law. And in some articles I recently published, I refer to this as the Baha'i legal imagination. What is the Baha'i legal imagination that Baha'u'llah encourages? How does he encourage us to approach law? So that's what I thought we would explore for this little bit of time today. And just to set it up a tiny bit more, the idea of a legal imagination is really, and I'm encouraging you just to think about your own orientations and ways of thinking about law generally. And so when I use the term legal imagination, I'm talking about three things. One, I'm talking about the meanings we ascribe to law in our lives. Just the basic connotations you can think about to yourself, the connotations you associate with law. Is it about, you just think about rules? Do you think about force? Do you think about how enforcement occurs? Do you think about institutions? Do you think about legal actors? Do you think about fear? Do you think about guilt? Do you think about morality? Whatever they are, that's one aspect of it, is just the meanings that we ascribe to law in our own life. The second aspect of a legal imagination is the way in which we envision law being practiced. What is our vision of law in action in the world around us? And a central part of this is, do you think of yourself, do we think of ourselves as legal actors? In the society I'm in Canada and the United States, with the predominant legal order in these countries, I don't think it draws a lot of individuals to think of themselves as legal actors. But of course, individuals from many of their traditions, at the same time that we might be in whatever society we live in, we also think of ourselves as legal actors in different traditions, in different ways. And so how do we envision ourselves in relation to the law? How do we envision it being practiced? And then the last aspect of a legal imagination is the power of law. Do we feel law has a real power in our lives? How does it operate? Or do we feel it's very distant or something remote? Is it something intimate to us, or that really affects the choices we make, or not? And so that's just very generally what I'm talking about when I talk about a legal imagination. So just holding those meanings, the vision, and the power of law in mind, I sort of wanted to just work through three questions to try to explore what a Baha'i legal imagination is and how Baha'u'llah talks about that. And the three questions are: what are predominant ways, just generally, that we think about law? Then what are signposts for thinking about Baha'i law specifically, both from texts themselves and from how Baha'i law is practiced? And then what are the implications of those? And in all of this, the whole idea is just for you to think about your own ways of thinking about Baha'i law, and then thinking about how Baha'u'llah encourages us to think about Baha'i law, and what's the distance between those two things. And if there is a distance, what should we be doing to close that distance, to deepen the understanding of how Baha'u'llah encourages us to think about Baha'i law, and then how to apply that to our own ways of thinking about it more and more. So just the first question, just how do we think about law generally? And how do you think about law generally? What is your own imagining about law? Not Baha'i law specifically, but just generally. And so this slide is really just a mirror for you to think about that. So, what are some of the common frames as individuals that we use to think about Baha'i law? Examples of, many people will immediately start thinking about rules or systems of order or enforcement, or something very formal, or something very public, very systematized, very specialized, requiring very professionalized expertise, something very external to themselves, something that is driven by perhaps fear or why do we obey it? Why do we follow it? Because of sanctions, because of punishment, right? These are very common associations, common connotations. They'll be different for different people. The point is just, what are yours? Because we want to compare some of what yours are to how Baha'u'llah encourages us to think about his frames for thinking about law. There's also individual frames, and by this I mean all of us are at the intersection of different conceptions of law, different ways of thinking about law. We're all at the intersections of multiple sets of laws, culturally, traditionally, religiously, socially, the societies we live in, the societies we travel to. So we're all going to be at the intersection and have been affected by many of them. There's many historic frames, very common ways of thinking about law. And the list I've put there, divine commandment, morality, reason and logic, utility, politics and power, that's basically covers all of the main schools of legal theory throughout history across societies. Law is tied up in theology and spirituality and commandments from the divine. Law is intertwined with morality and natural order of what's good and right. Law is the function of reason and logic. This is what's called legal formalism. Law is an expression of what is most useful and practical, and it's the greatest utility. Law is just a function of politics and power. These are all the ways law has been thought about historically in legal theory and in jurisprudence, all of the debates for thousands of years in different ways, traditions of thinking about law. So again, these are just examples trying to draw out as a mirror of how you might think about law. Then I put in here Islamic frames, and obviously emphasizing those as a specific purpose and starting to think about the Baha'i legal imagination, because this would be the legal frame, the way of thinking about law that Baha'u'llah came into and the b-i-Aqdas was revealed into. And, if you step back and look at the Islamic framing of law, and there's different ways to tell the history of it, but one snapshot, which both is relevant in the Sunni and Shiite context, but it's largely a Sunni story, and then a bit later the Shiite story carries forward many of the same principles and aspects. In the Quran, you had, very little overt, explicit legal content. And then as Islam spreads very rapidly, you have all sorts of plural, diverse expressions of law, the merging of Islamic law and its particular expressions within different cultural and social contexts as Islam spreads. And then by the 10th, 11th centuries, using using the calendar we use in this part of the world, not the Islamic calendar, you have a real effort to sort of synthesize and come up with a science of law that would work. And out of this was born what is called in Arabic usul al-fiqh, or the science of law. And basically that science of law said there's 4 sources of law in Islam: the Quran, the Sunnah, which is the Hadith, the stories of the Prophet and the companions, and then there's the collective wisdom of the scholars of any age, that's called ijma, and then there's a very narrow form of reasoning, the type of analogical reasoning where you could deduce things. And those 4 sources, if you really step back and think about them, are very constrained. They're very tied towards the text and the intention of the text. They're a method of finding what was intended in the Quran. And the pure theory that was born in the 10th and 11th century was that every individual had a responsibility to go into the text and using only those 4 methods of deduction to figure out what the rule is and then apply it to oneself. And nobody could interfere in that process. It was an individual obligation. It was an individual responsibility. Everybody had to do it for themselves. So in that reasoning, there's no general rules that could be developed other than the few that were known from the Quran itself. everyone had to figure it out for themselves and apply it for themselves. And then those rules would disappear. This is a method of reasoning and striving called ijtihad, which was the foundation of Islamic legal theory. Of course, in practice, it doesn't become that way. In practice, what becomes rationalized over hundreds of years is that every individual could just blindly imitate somebody who's learned, somebody who's trained in those sciences. So the practice of just imitating clerics who understand the rules and just doing what is said, or the books from the different schools that were developed of rules, you could just blindly imitate. You didn't have to turn your mind to it as long as you were following an authority. And so this becomes the main pattern. You have different schools of very detailed rules develop in the Sunni world, and in a bit later in a way throughout the Shiite world. And you have this very rule-oriented set of practices, very detailed rules. So this is a very textualist, very intentionalist, very structured, very rule-oriented, where even though in the pure theory our rational intermediation should be guiding what we follow and how, in reality we're just pushed to blindly imitate. And the quote you'll see there is from Abdu'l-Baha describing this, and it's in the introduction to the Aqdas as well, and he's describing this background. In the religion of Islam, similarly, not every ordinance was explicitly revealed, nay, not a tenth part of a tenth part was included in the text, that's the Quran. Although all matters of major importance were specifically referred to, there were undoubtedly thousands of laws which were unspecified. These were devised by the divines of a later age, that's the age I just described, and ongoing. According to the laws of Islamic jurisprudence, and individual divines made conflicting deductions from the original revealed ordinances. All of these were enforced. So this is the context, right? So this is, this question, ways of thinking about law. And I went through common frames, individual frames, historic frames, Islamic frames. Where those Islamic frames is how people in Baha'u'llah's time, in his context, would think about law. Those would be foundations of it. So moving from that question to the Baha'i legal imagination then, right? And keep that Islamic one in mind that I just described. And then let's think about how is Baha'u'llah encouraging? I mean, you can imagine those followers at the time in 1873 when he reveals the b-i-Aqdas, or today. What are the ways he's encouraging you to think about law? What is aspects of that meaning, vision, and power that make up Baha'i legal imagination? Well, I put a list of textual signposts there. These are all actual words from various texts. So, and let's see what they tell us. So, think not we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. That's paragraph 5 of the b-i-Aqdas, right? That is a statement that's saying this isn't just another book of the rules, the books of fiqh, like I just described. This is not that. Or he says, observe my commandments for love of my beauty. That's in paragraph 4. And then, he's saying, why should we observe? Well, I just described a notion of observing law in the Islamic context that says blind imitation of somebody who's learned. Well, that's fine. That's a justification to observe because somebody's learned had said, this is what you should do. Well, here he's saying, observe my commandments for love of my beauty. And there's another dimension, which I alluded to earlier, and it's in the next two statements, which is one has to observe them lovingly and knowingly with understanding. That's why throughout the Aqdas and in the introduction to the Aqdas and the description of the Aqdas by Baha'u'llah himself, he always talks about the necessity for apprehending what's in the book, for having insight into it. Or on the flip side, this statement from the Universal House of Justice from one of their letters, which I think is from 2000, I should have put the date in, but it's online, where they say genuine ignorance of a law is acceptable as an excuse for not adhering to it. right? Talking about Baha'i law. Why? Because of this role of knowledge being central. We need to understand why. Also, the next one, in observing them, one must exercise tact and wisdom. This is in the introduction to the Aqdas as well from Baha'u'llah. Right here, he's starting to talk about the social dimension of the application of Baha'i law, that certain contexts socially are required for how they should be adhered to, how they should be followed, how they should be applied. The next four textual statements are from the research department to of the Universal House of Justice, from a letter they wrote or a memo they wrote to the Universal House of Justice in 1996. And here they're talking really about the style and form and language of the Kitab-i-Aqdas. And they say the laws are evolutionary and organic in conception, that they need to be understood, quote, according to their informing spirit and not the letter of the law. And then they say further that there's an observable tendency in the Kitab-i-Aqdas to deal with whole areas of legislative concern by reference to a single representative example. And connected to that, they say Baha'u'llah's style in the book is to use the utmost economy of diction. Here is the notion that, we might see what looks like a rule in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, but it's actually standing for something, a much broader area of concern. It's an example of something much more foundational and underlying, something much more broader, something much bigger. And connected to that, when you're reading something that you would turn your mind to and say, okay, that's the letter of the law. Well, they're saying here the intention is that they be understood according to their informing spirit and not the letter of the law. That this isn't a practice, just like in the first statement, think not revealed a mere code of laws, that we should be taking our time to list these things as rules and apply them as rules in that way. We need to understand and read the text in a way that gets to the layers and depths that goes beneath the economy of diction that underlies it and is there. Part of this is also seen if you think about the structure of the Kitab-i-Aqdas, and I won't go into this at length, but there's been a tendency to always emphasize or believe or assert or argue that the Kitab-i-Aqdas is largely an unstructured text, that it's a mix of metaphysical, ontological, philosophical, theological reflections, a mix of more legally sounding statements, and it kind of moves back and forth to these, between these. But there's other ways to think about the text and how it's structured. And just to give one example, if you open and using these statements from the research department as a signpost for it, the utmost economy of diction, the informing spirit. And if you just look at the first 19 paragraphs, you can see a sense of structure within there, in that, the first paragraph opens, in the writings, both Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha talk about how the structure of reality is in an arc of ascent and descent, and, a descent from God on through the worlds of the spirit down to humanity, and then of ascent from humanity up towards God. And this is how the world is structured. You can think of it in this form of an arc. The first paragraph is the arc of descent. And through those first 5 paragraphs, you see the description of the arc of our arc of descent right through the first paragraph, and then reaching the plane of human beings and describing us as that meeting place between the spiritual and the physical in the way that we are. Then you can see the ascent begins in paragraphs 6 through 18 is the foundations of ascent, the core spiritual practices that are required for ascent. And so that's prayer, fasting, which I know many people are probably engaged in right now, as well as repetition, meditation of certain terms. And so that's the infrastructure of ascent, right? We've descended, and now the book is going into how do we ascend back towards our true spiritual selves and reality and towards God. And then paragraph 19 is the shift, right? Very short paragraph, backbiting, adultery, and murder. It's one sentence, and it is the spiritual, social aspects of, in the most condensed economy of diction way, the social dimension of ascent. And by emphasizing those three things, it's Baha'u'llah emphasizing three antithesis to the foundational principle of unity in the aspect of life. Backbiting is the violation of unity, the turning on unity in terms of our thoughts, and adultery in terms of interpersonal relationships, the undermining of unity, and murder in terms of society as a whole and community and social order. And so they stand right as the informing spirit of unity, the essential reality of unity as the core foundation of Baha'u'llah's laws and teachings are being expressed there. So in paragraph 1 to 19, you have the arc of ascent and descent. You have the descent and then the ascent, both spiritually and socially, what must be done to ascend in the most condensed, economical way. Baha'u'llah has drawn that out. Through some understanding, some would say you could see the whole rest of the book as expounding on that descent and ascent. And of course, I know the original is not in paragraphs in Arabic, and in English it is in paragraphs, and it's in 190 paragraphs, and you have 19. These first 19 can be seen as a complete whole. And then the rest of the book is 9 times 19 in terms of the paragraphs. That's awfully speculative, but there's ways to see some of these principles and signposts. Again, this is part of a way of reading and thinking about law that is not reflecting many of the frames that we saw earlier, certainly not the Islamic ones, but certainly not many of the common ones that we carry with us. Just to carry on with that, and I'm going to stop relatively soon, is just practice signposts then. So that's a textual signpost for Baha'i legal imagination. What about practice signposts, how it's been used? And here, look at the history of Baha'i law, just like I told the history of Islamic law, look at the history of Baha'i law. And, we have this phrase in the writings of a divinely, from the House of Justice, of a divinely purposed delay around the application of Baha'i law. But if you look broader at the practice, we can see a whole series of aspects of this delay. The first delay, of course, is the delay in the revelation of the Aqdas itself. When Baha'u'llah proclaimed his mission in 1863, there were demands for laws came immediately, and you can understand why from that legal imagination I described, the Islamic one. These new followers, whether from the Baha'i tradition or the Islamic tradition, what do we follow now? What do we have to do? And Baha'u'llah hesitated to reveal laws. At one point, he revealed them and destroyed them. He says this in the Aqdas that he did this. He held them back. They were not revealed, and then they were not released. And then in 1873, a decade later, he finally does, but then he delays the dissemination and publication of the text. And then with that, there's statements around, using how they should be used or not used at the current time. Then we see the tradition carry on, of course, of the very contextual application of the laws. It's not till the 1930s that the Guardian really turns his mind to certain of the social laws and whether they applied or not, and even starting to talk about, yes, this might be a time like laws around drinking alcohol. It's in the 1930s that he says this is now a time to think about beginning to adhere to these, some 50, 60 years later, after the revelation is when he does that. Of course, the translation of the text is not until 1992 in an official way, over a century later. The pattern of many laws that could be applied to individuals and aspects of our lives are not at this point. That's a decision for the Universal House of Justice to make when they wish. Huge areas where legislation or development of rules and standards could be expressed or left to individual conscience. So all of this is, reinforcing a Baha'i legal imagination that's very contextually bound, that is very focused on, encouraging not to become preoccupied with the delineation of specific rules, but while there are aspects of rules in the b-i-Aqdas, but to think about how they become integrated within a much broader process of spiritualization in life, a legal imagination that sees law not as the main driver of social change, the first doorway through which society is changed, but one that follows much broader processes of shifting patterns of knowledge and talking and relating amongst peoples. So just to bring some of that together, the third question and last question, and put a finer point on it, what are some of the implications of this, these signposts? This from, again, all I did was go through statements from texts themselves, whether from the sacred writings or from the Universal House of Justice or from the research department, or how Baha'i law has been used in practice. And, in those, you can see a number of themes and just and implications. And the first one, and I'll put a finer point on it than I have so far, in terms of the individual, is the primary legal actor in the Baha'i reality right now is the individual, is you, is me, is anyone who's intersecting and interacting with these laws. It's not an institution. It is not a set of institutions. It's not a system. The primary legal actor is the individual, where the law and interacting with them is the process of cultivating love and knowledge and our capacities of love and knowledge, which of course is the foundation of the process, how we understand the nature of the human soul and the nature of spiritual growth. The prayers Baha'i say every day is, I've been witness of God has created me to know thee and to worship thee. That's the knowledge and love dimension. Our interaction with law is not in a separate sphere apart from that. It is embedded within it. It is part of the broader process of spiritualization, individually and collectively. Over time, it is certainly projected by Baha'u'llah that these legal dimensions of his teachings will also have a greater role in social ordering, influencing short social ordering, shaping social patterns. But right now, both textually and from what we see of practice, the primary locus of where the interaction with law is embedded is within ourselves as ourselves. This is also reflected, for example, in statements from Shoghi Effendi, where he talks about the main requisites of spiritual growth, right? And when he talks about the standards of the laws, it's talked about as each day coming closer and through striving to the standards that are met. Like our personal spiritual growth is tied up with the striving to do better and more each day. There's also has implications individually, right, for the necessity for the focus to be on ourselves in relation to the laws and not preoccupied with judgment of others. We're all steeped in traditions, religiously and non, where our preoccupation is with as much or more with the behavior of others than with the behavior of ourselves. And here, by focusing right from the outset on our own knowledge and our own love as the foundation, and positioning these laws as engines of our spiritual growth, and knowing that in the Baha'i teachings, the only responsibility for one's spiritual growth and destiny is oneself, and no one can interfere or be an intermediary in that. It's really reinforcing that law and the essentiality of law and the relationship to the laws is primarily a preoccupation and responsibility of ourselves to ourselves, and not an arena like in many other traditions historically of judging and being preoccupied with how others are. Again, as time and, we know the writings about many of these laws are for a future society and how that will evolve. Yes, these will all evolve to have, or some will evolve to have, different roles in social ordering as time goes on. But that's not where we are now. And this is an evolutionary and organic process, as we saw earlier from the statement from the research department. Just briefly, just to end on the social side, right, it just is important to emphasize, unlike in many traditions, including Islamic traditions, predominant ones, but also in how we think about societies, many societies around the world. When we think about how society changes, there's often a reflex to think about law. And we want to change something, we change law, we change how it's enforced, we change how it operates, we change what it says, and that's how society will move one way or another. And our organs of government are organized this way. Well, that's not the primary approach, Baha'u'llah's approach to social change, which is a much more diffuse and epistemic approach. By that it means what Baha'u'llah says is and pushes is that the fundamental shifts in social change and how social change occurs consistent with equality and unity in those principles is it operates first at the level of knowledge and meanings and norms that change organically through how people's relations and understandings with each other occur. And then the place of law, which by its nature is coercive and forceful in that, is a follower, not a driver. But that's a much bigger topic that we might get into another time, but that is another implication of what we said. I think I'll leave it there and turn it back over. It's been about 40 minutes, and I think that's probably enough. But I hope that gives a snapshot of what I said at the beginning about we all carry our own legal imaginations, including how we think about Baha'i law. And then I've tried to describe what I understand, one understanding of how Baha'u'llah encourages us to think about the legal imagination of his teachings.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. A very interesting presentation, and it reinforces some of the things I'd been wondering about, though I hadn't been wondering about them in the context of law, such as the whole question of social change and not focusing on just changing laws, but changing the people. And that's clearly what you also emphasized, that the law is not the primary driver of these issues, but it needs to follow the changes that can be actually wrought in the society with the attitudes of the people, the culture. One question I have, and we have quite a few questions, I'm glad to say, but I wanted to ask a question of my own first. You mentioned the Islamic legal imagination and the Baha'i legal imagination, but it occurs to me that a lot of even Baha'is have a certain Western legal imagination that they're coming from. So I was wondering if you had a way of describing what that is in some general sense.
Yes, so that's what I was getting at and emphasizing when I talked about, do you imagine yourself as a legal actor? Because and as well as the issue of the power of law in our lives, because the contemporary predominant Eurocentric orientation to law, which includes, common law traditions in Canada and United States and Australia and New Zealand, where law is in its own sphere. It's separate. It's discrete and professionalized. It's distant from people's lives. And we only interact with it in the most mundane ways, traffic lights and, where we park our cars and, basic ordering of day-to-day life, or when we do something wrong or in a conflict that is escalated. For the civil side of things. So many people can go through their lives, and most do, with only the mundane aspects of law kicking in, the least mundane being paying our taxes and writing a will and, marriage and divorce, perhaps in the, family related issues. But beyond that, very little. And so law is something that's distant and remote. And most people, if you ask probably why would we adhere to it or obey it or follow it, would be a mix of, well, it's just part of contributing to social order mixed with some fear of sanction and stigma. But in that respect, right, so that is quite distant, obviously, from the Baha'i legal imagination that I've described anyway in multiple ways. And it's also not very, it's also not dissimilar to the Islamic one, does lead to a particular focus on laws, sets of rules.
Mm-hmm.
We just have far less of them in the Western traditions,
Yeah.
unlike Islam, where every aspect of life has a value placed on it, a spiritual value, and hence a rule developed around it or sets of rules.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how it's thought about in the West, but it still just sees law as this formal, professionalized sets of rules that are applied through structures and systems. And, in all fairness, I would suggest, and I didn't get into it, but I was going to talk about it, that internal Baha'i discourses are community discourses, and this may be controversial or may not, but more than anything, I think as you dig under the patterns, we talk about them through Islamic holdover ways of talking about law and very Western holdovers ways of talking about law. And that's like many things in the Baha'i faith. It takes generations for those shifts to occur.
Sure.
But I think the predominant ways we think about Baha'i law are from those two frames.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. And so that underlines the importance of today's talk even more, to understand the imagination, the legal imagination Baha'u'llah had in mind for us, as it were.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. Well, one person says, are non-Baha'is exempt from the application of Baha'i laws? There's a question that I see.
So the quick answer is yes. And the even further answer is most Baha'is are exempt from the application of most Baha'i laws. And then that's the reality, of the ones we know. And there's very few. Why? Because it's that quote I read from Abdu'l-Baha goes on to say that's why in this dispensation, the authority to legislate laws is that of the Universal House of Justice. Like that's where it goes on. They haven't chosen to do that. That to any great extent. And you would go even further and say the application of Baha'i laws to ourselves is interspersed with each of our individuals' trials and tribulations of the pathways of spiritual growth in life, which is why I didn't have the actual full statement in with me. But when the House of Justice or Guardian talks about the relationship between law and spiritual growth, they talk about the standard one has to meet is to strive each day to come a little bit closer to the standards in the writings. Like these are not dictums of dictates that one is condemned or saved based on how we do it. It is about the knowledge, the love, the struggle, the striving, and so forth.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good point. Another person asks, where can Baha'i constitutional law be found?
So Baha'i constitutional law, the term could mean a number of things. So, and really two, though they're interrelated. So one is we could talk about Baha'i constitutional law as the orders of governance and structure within the Baha'i community, of the Baha'i community.
Right.
So that, is found actually a fair bit in the b-i-Aqdas in terms of the foundations of it and authorities and roles and institutions. And, then, within Baha'i constitutional law, there's a large purview of space where many of the structures and roles that we see today are roles that the Universal House of Justice chose to create, whether it's counselors and so there's other changes, regional assemblies versus there's all these. So the structure of community life, the governance of community life the roles and boundaries and so forth. That's one way to talk about Baha'i constitutional law. Another way of talking about it, and so I don't know exactly what the questioner was speaking to, is to the relationship between Baha'i institutions, governing institutions, and governing institutions in the world at large.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really written about in two ways. One is all, and they're related, but it is all the writing about world order,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you see the most explicit writing of it in Baha'i texts, really in the writings of the Guardian, where he delineates in some length, and so we have some Baha'i literature that explores, international tribunal and, this and that and how that evolved. And then there's the more embedded within that, just the question of, in Baha'u'llah's teachings, is it intended? What is the intended role of Baha'i institutions in society at large? Which there has been some writing over the last 20 years in particular about whether Baha'u'llah imagined a theocracy where his institutions would be civil institutions, whether he envisioned a separation between Baha'i institutions and civil institutions, whether this is an unclear contingent thing that depends on context and will look different all over the place. So there is a fair bit of writing about that, exploring that. I'll be honest, in terms of that last question, if you look, and it's a whole nother topic for a whole nother talk, but if you look at signposts in the writings about answering that question specifically, you're going to see things that pull in all sorts of directions. Now, there's a lot that could be theorized and said about it, and it is worth reviewing. I will say that in the secondary literature on that question, you will find every possible answer to the question of what the relationship is intended between. You will find Baha'i luminaries saying it's intended that assemblies become civil institutions. You'll find Baha'i scholars and luminaries of great expertise say it's absolutely not.
Yep.
And that continues. So anyway, those are the three areas of Baha'i constitutional law.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question relating to this, I think by the same person, does the Baha'i constitutional law envision branch government, executive, legislative, and judiciary?
So here Shoghi Effendi talks about in some ways, but again, the answer is depending on which of those three categories we're talking about. Because in the world order category, for example, you see discussion of those traditional in the sense of Western constitutionalism categories of the separation of powers. Within the Baha'i system, that first one, you do not see precisely the same delineation of the separation of powers, but there we're talking about the community governance, and it's a different reality. So yes, there is discussion, and Shoghi Effendi, you'll see a separation, delineation of some of those in the world order discussion, not the same way in the administrative Baha'i internal constitutional discussion.
Let's see. One person asked this very interesting question. Is the Baha'i legal system adversarial, cooperative, or something else?
Well, so Baha'i legal system's a generous term right now because it's whatever we would say as a Baha'i legal order is very nascent at its current time. I mean, we don't really operate, remember, and that's why I emphasize, though I'm not saying that's the way it is for all time, that the primary legal actor is yourself, is oneself. And that's not the way it's always going to be, or at least from how Baha'u'llah describes the future and what we understand of it, that it's always going to be. And it has changed. It is organic and evolutionary, as even that history I talked about describes. But I will say there is very much a tension between what we understand of legal adversarialism and some of those informing spirits and principles that underlie Baha'i law, going back to the statement of the research department. Now, again, that would be a bigger topic, but if you just want to move into the issue of Baha'i consultation, and I do think we make a mistake by often talking about Baha'i consultation through the lens of praxis. It involves people saying what they have to say dispassionately and not having ownership over the ideas, and you do this and then you do that. But Baha'i consultation is really driven by a particular worldview and mindset that underlies it, a particular understanding of reality and what our principles, which is a very unity-based reality, and what that means for how we interact and engage, and then what our purpose is in coming together and making a decision. Baha'i consultation is a consciousness before it's a practice. It's a mindset before it's a set of practices. You can do the practices in very adversarial ways. We've all experienced it.
Yeah,
You can consult in very authoritarian ways. You can consult in very controlling ways. We are in the midst of, all sorts of shifts in human awareness and associations, from more adversarial authoritarian practices to the struggle for more integrative unity-based ones. But they are not matters of praxis alone. They are driven by the shift in consciousness. So it is not adversarial, and certainly in that sense. And if we did go deeper into the little bit of roles that assemblies currently play in applying standards in relation to a few laws, and it really is that
just a few
remote, the way in which they are intended to deal with it. Now, that may not well be the same of what a judiciary looks like in a Baha'i sense in the future, a term that we do see sometimes. But it certainly is intended to try to reflect this very contextually bound, unity-bound, educative approach to what a application of a law is meant to be. But again, that's all very nascent. Yeah.
Well, then this relates to another question, which is a bad question to ask an attorney, you might say. Will there be a need for attorneys in a future Baha'i society?
Well, I wish there was no need for lawyers in this society right now, but they're over. I mean, it's a question that's rooted in how we see society necessarily will transform over hundreds of years. There's always been legal professionals in every religious system. The issue is that in many religious systems, the legal professional and religious authority, clerical authority, become quite conflated in many ways. That certainly is not a pattern that we will see in the faith. But in terms of how society will evolve and where it is yet to go, I can't imagine the waning of professional roles in any time but a very distant time. What I can imagine is the transformation of how those professional roles are played. That should be happening and pushing. I don't think there's any way to look at professional roles of lawyers in today's, I'm speaking now really about Canada and the United States, where I am more intimate with, you can't say it's not in a state of total crisis in terms of imagining what the role of the lawyer is and should be. That's undergoing seismic shifts right now, but that's a much bigger discussion.
Interesting. Yeah, it would make sense if someone is accused of a very serious crime that they should have somebody to assist them in their defense, because they're often so wrapped up in their own situation emotionally that they can't always think through the best way to present what their side of the story is, I guess you could say. So certainly one could see the role of
always,
of someone to help them out. And here's another question. I'm not sure quite what they're asking. What about thinking about Baha'i rights and responsibilities as we think about citizenship generally? Can we think about Baha'i law that way?
I'm not exactly Sure. If the issue is citizenship, meaning that when one is a citizen of somewhere, they hold certain responsibilities to a collective and they hold certain rights that are to be respected. Um, I mean, uh, I think it's an interesting thought. I'd have to think about it more, but I guess my first intuition is in some ways I would struggle with it a little bit
Hmm.
in the sense that the Baha'i legal imagination I was describing really is placing the primacy of the relationship to law as being about the individual's responsibility for themselves and their own spiritual growth and development, and that it's less concerned with rights and responsibilities to the broader community or others at this time, just like assemblies, if you read any of the writings and the contemporary ones or guidance from the House of Justice about how assemblies are to function, it really is not to be intruding into the spiritual lives of individuals or
Right.
their struggles or so forth in a way, and really play educative and supportive and caring, loving roles in relation to that. Now in the future, the rights and responsibilities discussion, I think, may take on much more. I think that's where I think that is an analogy that can have much more strength to it and worth exploring for sure.
Interesting. A few more questions on the Q&A side. Um, does national governance also get guided to develop by Baha'u'llah's laws? So do Baha'u'llah's laws influence national governance?
Well, that's part of that. At one level, that's part of the church and state question that I raised. I think, but without going into that whole institutional question, yeah, I mean, part of the orientation towards law that I described and the brief allusion I made to social change and our internal discourses is, I think Baha'is talk a lot right now about influencing discourses
Mhm.
in society. And part of this discussion of law, part of it was building to the point of saying, when there's certain fundamental vision in Baha'u'llah's teachings about how society changes, which is quite different than where a focus often goes in international or domestic discourses about how do we affect positive change in a very difficult
Mhm.
situation. And part of it was to describe, which I didn't do in detail, that in the Baha'i system, there's really a hierarchy of how social change occurs. And it occurs first at the level of social meanings, which is the that's the infrastructure of any discourse. It's the associations that people make to a phenomenon, the way their mental way of associating to something, which can steer you. It's very powerful, right? Where it steers you. If everybody in a society, if there's a shared association that something is really bad, even if there's no law, I'm unlikely to do it because the stigma associated with it, right? Like
Sure.
if you'd put me on the screen today and the first thing I did was start smoking, everyone would have thought I was nuts. They wouldn't have thought that 40 years ago. They would have been expecting me to.
Yeah.
And there's no law against me smoking in my own bedroom here,
Right.
right? But I wouldn't do it because even if I wanted to, because of the stigma, the pressure, just because of how social meetings, the architecture of them. Well, when we talk about changing discourses of society, we're talking about influencing the architecture of social meanings. Because once you do them, if you move social meanings in a more unity-driven way or this or that, and we could break down any set of social meanings and any discourses and get into it, you create space, then people's behaviors start changing that's the normative change starts going. That then creates space for legal change, formal changes in ways that are less divisive and less dividing. So this is all, yeah, Baha'is, but this legal discourse we have internally and the social change dimension of it, and then we could pick 10 specific, social areas of social meanings that are going on and break them down. By this approach and understanding how social change can occur in a more unifying way is something that should then be impacting how we're interacting with national governments and how they're pursuing social change, which will have legal dimensions or not. So yeah, it can become quite influential, short of that big discussion about Baha'i institutions and civil institutions and who's
Right.
running things and all of that sort of stuff.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Here's another couple. We have a couple more questions still. What are your thoughts about apprehending the laws, apprehending the laws? And if we don't understand them, should we just submit to them, quote, under his command?
So, part of it I would encourage, and I wish I had that, the date of that letter from the Universal House of Justice that I read, the one quote about genuine ignorance or whatever the exact term was. The second is apprehending is a ongoing process. Yep. It's not a static process. It's not that any day I can say, okay, I got it now.
Yeah.
And move on with it. The third, and so that's an ongoing organic evolutionary process. And more so in the faith, the rationale that the logic of doing something simply because God said so is never a fully complete legitimate rationale in the faith for doing something. I mean, this is straight throughout the writings that the importance, the fundamental individual responsibility we have to keep coming to deeper and deeper and deeper understanding and awareness as a motive rationale for doing more and more and more. Intention, right? My intention, my sincerity, my consciousness, my awareness is vitally important. That doesn't come about from just doing something because of external rationale for doing it. It said I should do it, I will do it, right? That is a frame from using the analogies in the Baha'i writings of childhood, adolescence, adulthood, right? That is an authoritarian, childlike orientation. I'm just going to do it because X said so to do it, right? We should not interpose the clerical imagination and structure into our own interaction with Baha'i law. We should, that is never what, in my understanding, is what is intended.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It would be at best a temporary solution while you are trying to continue to apprehend things. Yeah. Victoria says, how can Baha'is talk about Baha'i law with greater society using this approach of the Baha'i legal imagination?
I mean, this is hard. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure we should be, well, I think there is value to, as a community, and I think this is part of what we're doing more and more, to learn to talk about and offer an understanding of how Baha'i law operates and understood, the vision of law in society to the broader society, because, and so it really goes to, there's certain aspects of Baha'i law that I think are extremely valuable to start putting out there. I think one of the main ones is, how do we pursue social change in extremely diverse contexts, which reinforces and is less divisive and can reinforce social unity? That's a discourse in Baha'i law, which I described. And so one area in which to learn how to talk about it is to talk about why Baha'u'llah pursues social change the way he does and the way he has and the way we're instructed to do it. It is an application of the principle of unity to pursue less coercive, less divisive, more responsive to unity dimensions. The second thing, and this is a bigger question, is of course I would assume that most people find it difficult to talk about specific aspects of Baha'i law because of how specific Baha'i laws appear at this time out of step with well-established norms that exist in many societies across the world. This is one reason why I emphasized what I did today in the talk, because the struggle with that, I think, is often a struggle because of the imaginations we're pushing into Baha'i law that we hold from elsewhere. And so one of the goals today was to try to pull back from that a little bit and just offer some perspectives on how to think about Baha'i law that can maybe help provide new ways of talking about it in society. I don't know if I really answered the question. It's a bigger question, and we'll get into specific topics, which I know we don't have time to now, but it's a few thoughts anyway.
Yeah, that's very helpful, I think. Another question here, which just popped up in the chat side. Which one is more emphasized in the Baha'i legal system, forgiveness or justice?
The role of the individual is forgiveness. The role of institutions is justice. And that's his statements from, I can't remember if it's from Guardian or Abdul, very explicitly saying that the role of the individual is to forgive, which is why one of the things I emphasize about we shouldn't be preoccupied with judging others. That's not our responsibility or role.
Right.
The role of institutions have to play the role of judgment and justice. Not so much today. That's getting into the bigger issues of, when Baha'i laws like the ones about social order and this and that. But the emphasis now, so they both have roles, right? But as individuals versus institutions, our orientations and relationship to those roles is different. So it's not really a hierarchy. It's not one or the other. But the emphasis certainly right now for all of us is in the realm of forgiveness more than anything. We aren't, as a community and as we're structured and as our administration, we're not in the business of judgment at any level really. Yeah. Right now. We're the business, even where institutions are playing a role in helping people, it's all about educative, it's supportive. It's very rare that you get into the, one or two sanctions that even exist in the Baha'i community and how rarely they're used and how even then the role of the individual is just forgiveness and not judgment. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, that's a very important point when you look at those specific issues of the current issues in Baha'i law, what people can violate. They are pretty rare.
Yes.
That's a good point. Hebrawalk asks this interesting question. Aren't Ruhi classes like introduction to the Baha'i laws in the future? I'm not quite sure what he's asking there, but it's sort of an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. I guess all I would say is, classes on Baha'i law in the future. I don't think we really have sets of, and I'm not sure we need them right now, really accessible sets of materials for how to study. I mean, I know it comes up in specific topics and here and there in the various of the books and so forth, but how learning about Baha'i law will become more of a community practice in the future, I don't know. I think it's a wide open question at this point. As you can see, the Aqdas was translated 120 years after it was, released. This is not, and the Guardian chose, of course, what he was going to prioritize for translation over, many, many decades. So, and then the House of Justice the same. So, right. I mean, there's a lesson in there. There's wisdom, of course, in there somewhere.
Perhaps it will come up in Ruhi Book 25 or something like that, if we have that many. Well, that looks like we have all the questions now. Great. And we had a very good set of questions today, I must say. I'm impressed by our audience as always. So I want to thank you very much, Roshan, for this fascinating presentation, which I think will give us all a new way to look at Baha'i law. And the comparison between our way of looking at Baha'i law and the Western Islamic ways, I think, is particularly illuminating. We often understand something best by comparing. So that I find particularly useful. So I want to thank you very much for this particular presentation today, and we look forward to seeing you again probably in another few years with another presentation, or even more so if we get a course on Baha'i law. I hope you'll be able to help us prepare that course and help teach it. We are still hoping to do that at some point. I want to thank everyone. People are saying thanks a lot, and thanks, Roshan, and this was a great class and all that in the various comments, so I need to pass those on to you as well. To remind everybody, we have a web talk on the 29th, so we have quite a long stretch, and then we have them 3 weeks in a row. So we have 3 coming up in late March and early and mid-April. So to wrap, thank you everybody for participating, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future in some other of our Wilmette Institute web talks.